Hello, you're about to listen to a radio program provided by the Limestone Church of Christ, located in Kingston, Ontario. Please feel free to check us out on the web at lookinguntojesus.net.
Hello and welcome to today's program. We're glad you're tuning in. My name is Tom Rainwater, and William Stewart is here with us to study God's Word, and it's always good to have you on the program, William.
Certainly glad to be here, Tom.
And today we are continuing our series about conversations that Jesus had with people in the Gospels, and we've been going chronologically through Jesus' life, and now we're to the point of Jesus' crucifixion. And the conversation that we're going to analyze today is that between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. And so our text will be in John chapter 18, John 18 and verse 28, and we'll continue into chapter 19. Now up to this point, Jesus has been betrayed by Judas Iscariot and thus arrested by the Jews and brought into court and being questioned by the high priest. And so Jesus is now being tried by Pilate, Pilate being the Roman governor of that region. When we look at John 18:28, it says, "Then they," speaking of the Jews, "led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium." The Praetorium was the Roman headquarters where the governor resided. So this is where Pilate stayed when he was there in their region. And it says it was early morning. But they themselves, the Jews, did not go into the Praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And William, seeing as how they're about to try to influence the Romans to crucify Jesus, aren't their priorities a little bit out of whack?
Indeed, Tom. It seems as though they're majoring in minors and minoring in majors, or as Jesus accused them of on another occasion, that they've forgotten the weightier matters of the law and they're focused on those minor things. Certainly, it was important for a Jew to keep the Passover. It was a commanded feast. And yet here they are putting to death our Passover, putting to death the Christ.
And so naturally, William, when they bring Jesus to Pilate, Pilate wants to know why they brought him there. What has he done? What's the charge against him? And they answered in verse 30 and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." So why should you even ask? He's evil, so let's deal with him.
The problem was, Tom, they didn't have any charges to bring up against him. They wanted to get rid of him. He was a nuisance to them, more than a nuisance to them, and they wanted to destroy this man. Pilate, being a good judge in some respects, he wants there to be some set-out charges. He wants to know, what is this man accused of? And certainly, as we'll go through the text, we'll see that he's concerned with, what have you done? Why is it that they want to put you to death? And yet, all they have to say of him, he's an evildoer. We wouldn't have brought him to you if that weren't the case. And so just take our word for it. Just go ahead and take him.
I think Pilate in verse 31 perceives that they're wasting his time, because he says to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." So Pilate understood, all right, you're bringing this man here for a religious reason, and that's not why I'm governor. I'm not here to deal with things like that. You judge him according to your law. I'm not interested in this. And the Jews said to Pilate, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." That's true according to Roman law. Capital punishment would be something that would be only allowed by the Roman authorities. Now, according to the law of Moses, there were different reasons that a person could be put to death. So the Jews didn't like the Romans to say, well, you can't do this. But here the Jews, because they want to push this over into Pilate for him to take care of it, they say, oh, it's just not lawful for us. We're not going to do anything against Roman law. Oh, not us.
It's rather convenient for them that if they could put Jesus to death on the spot, they would do it. But they're able to bring him to Pilate and say to him, well, we can't do that, but we know he's an evildoer, and therefore we bring him to you. We want you to take care of putting him to death. It's interesting. We look down to verse 32. It follows in line with what verse 31 says. The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death," that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Jesus had foretold exactly how he was going to die, and in fact we could go back so far as Psalm 22 and find foretelling of how Jesus was going to die there. But in Matthew chapter 20 and at verse 18, Jesus is going up to Jerusalem, and he's with his disciples. He says, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles, to mock and to scourge and to crucify, and the third day he will rise again." And again in John chapter 12, and at verse 32, Jesus signified the death, or spoke of the death that he would have. He said, "And if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all peoples to myself." And then John, commentating on that, if you will, he says this, he said, signifying by what death he would die. And so this is all in the plan of God. This is all God's working, God's will being performed. That certainly doesn't nullify the responsibility of the Jews and the guilt of the Jews on this occasion. But certainly we see here the plan of God taking shape.
Yes, William, I'm glad you brought out those verses. I mean, when you think about Jesus, before he dies, giving details about his death, that's another indication that he's somebody special. He's the Son of God. Because who on this earth today could give details concerning their own death? We can't do that. Obviously, the manner of death described is death by the Roman government, death by crucifixion. Once the Jews said, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, now it's in Pilate's hands whether he likes it or not. So in verse 33, it says, "Then Pilate entered the praetorium, again called Jesus, and said to him." So here is the beginning of this conversation between Jesus and Pilate. And Pilate asked a simple question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus doesn't give him a yes or no answer at the beginning.
That's right, Tom. In fact, he asked him, "Well, who are you asking this for? Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Though the Jews didn't give Pilate any charges, remember he was seeking some charges against the man, what's he accused of, it does seem that they did give him some tidbits in order to chew on. One of the things that they seem to have said is that he claims to be the King of the Jews. Certainly in Jesus giving that response of a question, he's not denying whether he's the King of the Jews or not, but he's saying, well, why are you asking? Are you inquiring on your own account, or was it because somebody prompted you to inquire about that? And if he were, in fact, the King of the Jews in a political sense, you would think that Pilate would already know that. And wouldn't it seem odd that the Jews are delivering up their own king? The Jews who want to be free from the Romans. And so Pilate should understand there's some deception going on here on the part of the religious leaders.
Mm-hmm. William, when you think about the question itself, are you the King of the Jews? It depends upon how it's being asked, or why it's being asked. That's important, because if Pilate was asking Jesus this question and he was curious for himself about Jesus' kingship, his spiritual kingship, then you've got a question that is a good question to ask and one that needs to be answered. But Pilate is not asking the question in this way. It's more or less, are you King of the Jews because this is what I've heard. When Jesus said, are you speaking for yourself or others, Pilate answered in verse 35, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priest have delivered you to me. What have you done?"
Then, Tom, as we go on to verse 36, Jesus does tell Pilate about his kingdom and about his being a king. We're told that he answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." As he gives the answer to Pilate, he's revealing to him that his kingdom is no threat to the Roman government or the Roman Empire. That's not the nature of his kingdom. It would sound as though maybe the Jews were trying to portray that of Jesus, him to be a revolutionary or somebody who's going to rise up against the Romans. But Jesus makes it very plain that were my kingdom of this world, my servants would fight, but my kingdom's not from here. My kingdom's not of this world. He's dealing with a spiritual kingdom. And as I said, it was no threat to the Roman Empire, but it was no offense to the Jews, the kingdom that he proclaimed. Certainly, we can see by going back to Matthew 21 and beginning at verse 15, the offense that Jesus' kingdom presented to the Jewish leaders. It says, when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant and said to him, Do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, Yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants you have perfect praise. Here's people praising Jesus as the coming King, the Savior of God's people. And it was an offense to them, but it was no threat to the Romans. Again, in Luke chapter 19 and at verse 38, here's this saying of the people, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees called to him from the crowd, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. And yet Jesus responds and tells them, I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out. There's pictures throughout the Gospels that show that, yes, he's a king, and that, yes, he has a kingdom. But it was of no threat to the Romans. It was an offense to the Jewish leaders. And that's why they brought him under the guise, presumably, of bringing him as a revolutionary who's going to lead a revolt against the Romans. But Jesus makes it very plain, my kingdom's not from here, it's a spiritual kingdom.
That's right. There would have been many opportunities for Jesus to be made a physical king if that was his goal, if that was his mission. In John chapter 6, when he fed the 5,000, the people were so pleased about that, they tried to make him a king by force. And of course, he left them. He went to a mountain alone and went by himself, because he didn't come to be a ruler over a physical nation with physical armies. As Jesus said to Pilate in our text here in John 18, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. So he says, I'm not here raising armies. And you know, William, today, a lot of people have the false idea that Jesus is going to one day set up a physical kingdom with physical armies. But that's never been his goal, because his kingdom is a spiritual one. It is not of this world. It is not from here. And so therefore Pilate says to Jesus, Are you a king then? And Jesus answered, You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So Jesus says, I am a king in matters of truth, and that what I say is truth, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. So this kingdom is based upon Jesus' teaching and others responding, listening, and obeying.
That's right, Tom. It's evident that it's a spiritual kingdom, not an earthly kingdom. Pilate certainly would have some difficulty understanding that. As we move on to verse 38, Pilate has a question for him. Jesus indicated the purpose that he's come in the world is to witness to the truth. Those who are of the truth will hear his voice. And so Pilate asks him, well, what is truth? It's an interesting question coming from Pilate, and what the motivation behind it is, we don't know. Whether he's earnestly inquiring, or if he's scoffing at the Lord at this point, or if it's just mere curiosity on his part.
And William, looking at the verse, it seems to me that Pilate is saying that cynically. Because if he is asking a sincere question, what is truth, and ready to hear what that is, he would have stayed. But once he asks the question, he goes out. He says, when he had said this, he went out again. He wasn't waiting for an answer. He says, what is truth?
Yeah. Even though he may not understand Jesus, he'll tell them, I find no fault in him. He may be cynical regarding him, but he certainly understands that there's nothing in him that's worthy of death. There's no charges that could stand. There were no charges given. And upon his investigation, there's no reason to detain him any longer.
Now, Pilate here could have, at this point, William, said that, okay, I find no fault in him, I'm releasing him, and that's it. Don't bother me with this man anymore. But he said in verse 39, but you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And so I think Pilate expected a positive answer. All right, here's this person that I'd like to release. And they didn't want that. They called for somebody else.
That's right. They called for a man named Barabbas. Now, in this text, all we're told about Barabbas is that he was a robber. But as we look at parallel texts in the other Gospels, we find out that he was an insurrectionist. We find out that he was a murderer. He was just a sinister man. And yet here are the people, and they're crying out, release to us Barabbas. Give us this evil man, this man who is worthy of death. We don't want Jesus to be released. Pilate has already said there's no fault in him. He knows there's fault in Barabbas. And the people know there's fault in Barabbas. But Jesus was turned over on account of envy. The Jewish leadership wanted to get rid of him, and so they stirred the people. And they stirred them against Jesus in order that they might call for Barabbas instead.
And what an insult to our Lord. Jesus was sinless. He lived by the highest standard, had the highest character. He did miracles to benefit the people. Of course, his miracles proved who he was. He was the Son of God. But the people say, no, we don't want Jesus. We want this vile criminal. We want this rebel against Rome. In a sense, really, the Jews asking for Barabbas to be set free, they're really putting their own selves in danger politically. Because what is this Barabbas going to do when he's released? He's a danger to the people and can cause trouble between the Romans and the Jews. So in chapter 19, it says, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. Pilate says, okay, well, I'll just whip him for a while. And to be scourged is to suffer great pain and torture. And the Romans had these whips made out of leather, and at the ends of the strands of leather there would be pieces of metal or rock that were sharp. And so when they would strike a person with this whip, it would tear into their skin, rip their skin. And of course, we're talking about a scene that's very bloody. This is a cruel torture, and they're torturing an innocent man. So Pilate is hoping that, look, if I let my soldiers just punish him, maybe the Jews will be satisfied and we'll let him go.
Tom, as we keep on looking and we see verse 2, we're told that the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. We have a picture here, and of course the Romans, they did this all in mockery. They didn't acknowledge him as being a king of any sort. This was an opportunity of play for them, if you will. In mock, they gave him a crown. They twisted a crown of thorns, and it's not that they just gently placed that on his head. They put that on his head and such that it would have caused injury. And then put him in purple, the color of royalty, and bowed the knee to them, "Hail, King of the Jews." But then they went ahead, and after that they struck him. Just an awful mockery. And yet remember from the text that we read earlier where Jesus was foretelling the things that would take place. He said that he would be committed over to the Gentiles, that they might mock him, and then eventually be put to death. And so Jesus knew these things were coming. He foretold these things would happen, and it happened just as he said it would. In verse 4 then, we have Pilate who went out again. He tells the people, "I'm going to bring him out again. Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." The scourging and the mocking, they weren't because Pilate believed Jesus to be guilty of anything. As I believe you've said, he's doing this so that he might humiliate the Lord in the presence of the Jews and bring them out, and perhaps they'd be willing to allow him to go. And so he brought him out, and there he is wearing the crown of thorns and wearing the purple, and Pilate says, "Behold the man." Here's Jesus in the most humiliated of states. He's covered in blood, he's covered in sweat, but even though all of this had taken place, the Jews still were not satisfied. It wasn't enough.
Right, William, because in verse 6, therefore when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." And the Jews say, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." So the Jews aren't content with Pilate and the soldiers torturing Jesus. They want him dead. They want him completely out of the picture. And so Pilate hears for the first time that Jesus has claimed to be the Son of God, and now he's afraid. And now he wants to go back with Jesus and talk to him.
That's right, Tom. This is the accusation that he is asking for before. Remember, they wouldn't give an accusation before, and so finally they've given it. Here's why he's worthy of death. He made himself the Son of God. That scared Pilate. He goes to Jesus, "Where are you from? Now, who are you?" He's curious about this, and he's afraid about this. His wife came to him, as recorded in Matthew chapter 27 and at verse 19. We're told that while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." When he takes Jesus' words, his wife's dream, and now this accusation against him that he has made himself the Son of God, what a terrifying position he is now in. Now, Pilate doesn't understand the God of the Jews. But Pilate does understand gods. The Romans had gods and the Grecians had gods. And in their mythology, there were stories of incarnations. And perhaps Pilate here is considering this might be such a case that, what am I to do with this type of thing? And so he sought to know Jesus' origin. Where are you from? And Jesus gave not a word, no answer. If Pilate had been asking so that he might know who Jesus is and whether he should worship him or not, then by all means Jesus would attest to his deity. That's not why Pilate was asking. He was asking in order to know, what do I do in judgment of you?
Right, William, and I think Pilate is still looking at himself being on a much higher plane than Jesus. When Jesus doesn't answer his question, Pilate says, "Are you not speaking with me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" You know, it's like, how dare you not answer my question, because, look, I can make things rough for you. Pilate's not showing Jesus any respect at all. He doesn't really want to submit himself unto Jesus in any way. But here, once Pilate says, don't you know that I have the power to crucify you or to release you? Jesus answers that. He said, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above." So Pilate, there's somebody greater than you. You're a Roman governor, but there's a God in heaven. And things are going to be done according to His will and not yours. Jesus continues, "Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Well, what does that mean?
Well, when we saw Jesus being brought to the praetorium, it was Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, the elders of the people, who brought him. And so, as much as Pilate, who's going to condemn Jesus to death in just a few moments here in the text, is guilty of sin, Jesus says they have the greater sin. The Jewish leaders. He wasn't let off the hook because the sin of the Jews was so great. He still committed sin. In another of the gospel accounts, he washed his hands before the Jews in order to signify that he washes his hands of the blood of this man. Well, sorry, Pilate, you can't do that. You're guilty of the blood of this man because you sentenced him to death. And yet Jesus tells them, your sin is bad, but there's a greater sin going on here, the Jewish leadership. Yeah,
because when the Jews wanted Jesus dead, Pilate doesn't want him dead at this point. And like you said, Pilate gives into that, and he's still responsible for doing that. But at this point, Jesus having said that, in verse 12, "From then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, 'If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar.'" So the Jews knew how to push Pilate's buttons. They knew what Pilate would fear. Jesus is a competitor to Caesar, and you don't want to be on Jesus' side. And if you let him go, you are an enemy of Caesar. So that puts Pilate in a difficult position politically. And in verse 13, "When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha." So now it was the preparation day of the Sabbath, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests, now notice who's speaking here, the chief priests, the top Jewish leaders, answered, "We have no king but Caesar." These are the men, William, who hated Caesar the most. But if it was going to get Jesus crucified, they were willing to affirm that Caesar is their king and there's no other.
That's right. They hated Jesus more than they hated Caesar, and they wanted him dead. You mentioned from verse 12 that Pilate sought to release him from that point onward. And as he says, "Behold your king," again showing Jesus in this humiliated state, he is trying over and over to find some way that Jesus might be released, some measure of sympathy maybe among the people. He's been scourged, he's been mocked, and he's all bloodied. Again, shall I crucify your king? Look at the man. And yet they were hungry for his blood, even to the point that they will give their allegiance to Caesar on this occasion.
And so, William, in verse 16, it says, "So he delivered him to them to be crucified." The decision is made. He's going to go ahead and have Jesus crucified, though he knows him to be innocent. So they took Jesus and led him away. Jesus had to bear his cross, went out to the place of the skull, which is in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, with two others beside him, one on either side, Jesus in the center. And Pilate decides that he is going to put this sign, this title, on the cross above Jesus, and it said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews."
Just a little bit after that, Tom, were it not enough that Jesus is being crucified, the Jewish leaders still complain. They don't like the sign that Pilate put on. They'd rather it say, don't write the King of the Jews, but he said, "I am the King of the Jews." Remember, they're the ones who came and put that accusation against him of being the King of the Jews. But they're just not satisfied. They hate Jesus so much.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting also, William, that when Pilate puts that on the sign, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," he puts it in 3 different languages, so anybody could read it who goes by. Hebrew was the language of the Jews. Greek was the main language of the people during that day, and Latin was the Roman official language. They used Latin on Roman official documents, so it's in all 3 languages.
Pilate's not willing to play around with them. He, as you say, put it in those 3 languages, and after they've said change it, he says, "What I have written, I have written." It's staying the way that it is. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.
And so Jesus' suffering and humiliation begins to accelerate here. The soldiers casting lots for his garments. Jesus, as he's hanging up on the cross, suffering. It is a gruesome sight. But let's remember that Jesus voluntarily did this. He gave his life for you, for all of us, that we might be saved from our sins. He has paid the price. We deserve to be the ones to hang on that cross because of the things that we have done against God. But Jesus suffered on our account so that we might have life. If you have any questions about our Lord and His suffering and what He desires for us to do today, please let us know. We're here to help.